Well, happy Easter, everyone. Let me start by asking you a question. Has anyone been excited for the Blue Jays to be getting back in action? You know, now that we're a couple weeks into spring and we're just over a week into the baseball season, and I know we're not all necessarily sports fans or baseball fans, but if you are anything like our household, perhaps you got a little more into baseball and the Jays, because of their exciting playoff run last season. And if that's had you a little bit more tuned in to their season getting started and you've had maybe a little bit more extra excitement about that, I think that's because we remember this feeling. Check out this photo. Remember these moments, when the Jays won a couple of their playoff rounds and they'd celebrate on the field, but then they'd go into the locker room and they'd put on the ski goggles, they'd have the champagne bottles there and they'd shake them up, pop the corks and have this massive party and celebration. And isn't that picture worth 1,000 words of celebration? Now, I show us that this morning on Easter Sunday because did you know that for followers of Jesus and in the church, Easter Sunday is intended to feel like that? That Easter is actually the biggest day and the biggest deal and biggest celebration in the lives of Jesus followers and in the church community. However, I'm not sure whether or not you're sort of feeling that today or have been anticipating that. And I'm not even sure whether we always kind of reflect that in the church community. Especially compared to some other seasons in our lives. Think of Christmas where we've got a whole month leading up and, all the presents and the holidays, or even other seasons around here in our church community, ministry launch seasons where we have extra events or one church gatherings or meals together. But here's the thing, the reality is none of those things would even matter, let alone exist, if it wasn't for Easter. In fact, one biblical scholar suggests that I was reading recently is that because of the standalone significance and celebration of Easter, they would suggest that churches should actually serve champagne on Easter Sunday morning. Or better yet, get out their own ski goggles and, pop the corks and throw that kind of party. And perhaps some of you are thinking that might be more fun than listening to me for the next 15 minutes, and I get it, because perhaps that's kind of the point. But here's the thing. If Easter is intended to be that big a deal, why hasn't that always been our instinct? Or maybe sometimes you've kind of hoped that Easter would have that kind of celebratory effect or impact in your life. But maybe in your experience, sometimes you've been left more feeling like you actually lost Game 7 of the World Series in extra innings. But we're not going to get into that depth of pain. But here's the thing. If Easter is intended to be that big of a deal, but it hasn't always been our instinct, why not? And what is it actually about Easter that can make it ski goggle and champagne worthy of a celebration? Well, in the time leading up to the life of Jesus, there was a long-standing ancient Jewish hope that one day God would resurrect human beings and pour out his Spirit into them in a way that would bring new life and new restoration into the world. And that these two things, that resurrection and Spirit, would be these two world-changing markers that would identify the coming of God's kingdom into the world. And they had this hope for one day. Not for today, but for one day. One day far in the future. One day a long ways away from the realities of our lives today. Perhaps for Blue Jays fans at the beginning of the season, hoping that maybe one day, some 150 games or so from now, we might have a chance to be back there. And I wonder how many of us come into Easter kind of feeling similar or having that same kind of expectation. That maybe no matter where we find ourselves, on the spectrum of personal belief as it relates to Jesus or his resurrection, that we have this sense that while Easter is in fact a celebration, it's actually kind of a muted celebration that may only bring hope for one day. That maybe one day our lives could change. That maybe one day we could be made new. That maybe one day our world could experience more of the peace and the justice that we long for, or perhaps most common, that at best, Easter might just offer a ticket to a better place one day. Long after our lives these days. So we might as well save the bubbly for one day. But friends, when we lean into the Easter story, and maybe even not just the story, but the actual experience and effect on the lives of the first followers of Jesus, I think we might start to see why we could be wrong about keeping the bubbly on the shelves at Easter. Because according to Jesus' first followers, who again, up until that very first Easter, all believed that hope was just going to be saved for one day, they actually experienced something so shocking and so surprising that it not only changed and evolved their beliefs about one day, but it actually changed everything in their lives from that day forward. Listen to one of Jesus' closest friends and followers, a guy by the name of Peter, described this surprising impact of the events of Easter and experienced an event that created such a stir and celebration. He actually had to reassure onlookers that they hadn't had too much bubbly. This comes from Acts chapter 2, where it says, all of the followers of Jesus were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages. And then Peter stood up and he addressed the crowd of onlookers and he said, "Listen carefully, make no mistake about this. These people are not drunk, as some of you are assuming. No, what you see was predicted long ago by the prophet. The prophet who said, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit upon all people." Then a little further down, listen to how Peter interprets this. He says, "But God raised Jesus from the dead, and we are all witnesses of this here and now. And the Father gave him the Holy Spirit to pour out upon us, just as you see and hear today." That Peter essentially says that everything we have hoped for one day, God has begun to do in Jesus today. From these last days expectation to this today experience, Peter and the early followers of Jesus, what they experienced through Jesus' resurrection was that now Jesus had made his Holy Spirit available to them right here and right now to actually start to change their lives in intoxicating ways. That in what they witnessed through Jesus being raised from the dead is that Jesus alone held the power to overcome sin and death, which only reassured their hopes about one day. And though that through his resurrection, God has now poured out his Spirit into their lives and was doing something new and creating the possibility of a new life and a new world today, not just one day in the future. And friends, again, I wonder how many of us come into Easter wishing that could be true in our lives. That we have so much longing for a new kind of life and a new kind of world today. Not just the hope of an afterlife one day. That we wish we could actually have the capacity to grow or to change and to be transformed more into the kind of people that we most long to be, and that in our lives or relationships or our sense of purpose and calling in the world or the justice and peace that we long to see, that we wish we could experience that kind of, champagne-worthy resurrection and renewal that the Easter story is all about. And friends, again, if that is you today, well then, according to Peter, that's what's now even possible for us here in our day. Because a little later on, after the reality of Jesus' resurrection and this pouring out of his Spirit really began settling in and taking root in their lives and their community, listen to what Peter wrote to people who were starting to put their faith in Jesus, people just like us here today. In his letter known as 2 Peter, he writes this. He says, "By God's divine power, God has given us everything we need for living a godly life. We have received all of this by coming to know him, Jesus, the one who called us to himself by means of his marvelous glory and excellence." I want to unpack some of what this can mean for us on this Easter, because when you stop and think about it, this is quite a profound message that sends a very different message than Jesus just being about, a hope or celebration for one day somewhere else. As Peter says here, that God has given us everything we need for living. First of all, that he has given, past tense, it's already happened, been made available, for living right here and now, present tense, in the world today. And there's kind of three remarkable Easter-related features that Peter describes here to make this possible. The first is that he says that God has done this by God's divine power, which is essentially referring to any and all of the strength and might and power and energy and creativity and capacity that you could imagine being contained in the God of the universe. That God has given all of himself to give us everything we need. That this is what God has made available. And it's the same mighty power that has overcome death, that raised Jesus from death. The Apostle Paul describes God's divine power this way in his letter to the Ephesians, saying, I pray that you, people like us, will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe in him. He says, this is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead and seated him in the place of honor at God's right hand in the heavenly realms. Friends, it's this kind of divine power poured out and available at Easter that, again, makes it, pop the champagne worthy of a celebration. Then the second remarkable thing Peter says is that this power has given us everything we need for what? He says, for living a godly life. Now, the phrase godly life may sound a little bit cheesy or kind of religious-y, depending on how you hear it, and I get that. But what Peter was referring to, and what his original audience would have certainly understood, and how he described it, is that he was trying to speak to and describe, the kind of life that we all most long for, the kind of life that we dream of, the kind of life we tend to hope might be available one day. A life that could be infused with the goodness and love and peace of God, our Creator, making us capable of living and enjoying life as it's meant to be lived. This is what Peter is speaking to here. In fact, one translation of this verse actually translates it as the truly good life. Again, the life we all long for and long after. Or what Jesus described as life to the full when Jesus said, I have come that you may have life to the full. And what Paul describes as a life marked by the fruit of God's Spirit, a life of love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And friends, couldn't we all use a little more of that life? And couldn't our world use more of that life? Well, friends, once again, pop the champagne, because this is the kind of life that Peter says God has made available at Easter. And then third, Peter says that we can receive and really come to know this life by means of Jesus' marvelous glory and excellence. Now, once again, glory and excellence, these could come off as sounding kind of like empty, sort of Bible-y words. But again, in this context, and in the context of the Easter story, which Peter wasn't as far removed from, this is his way of referring to Jesus' death and resurrection. The very events of Jesus' life that we celebrate this weekend. That on the cross, Jesus showed the world the perfect excellence of God's love. His self-sacrificing, self-giving love, what the New Testament goes on to describe as the most excellent way of love. And then by his resurrection, Jesus revealed the glory of who he is as God's Son, bringing a new life and a new kingdom into the world. In fact, Jesus said it in a similar way on the very first Easter Sunday to two weary and grieving travelers that he found on the road who had felt like their one-day hopes had been dashed because of Jesus' death. But then as Jesus began to explain to them, he said it this way. He said, did not the Messiah have to suffer these things, have to give up his life, and then enter his glory? That again, Jesus wanted to make clear that it was actually through the excellent love of his self-sacrifice that then brought the glory of his resurrection. And in this new light, the eyes of those hopeless travelers on the very first Easter, they were open to recognize the risen Jesus. And as a result, receive everything they needed from him in a way that went on to change their lives forever. Friends, this is, the ski goggles and champagne worthy good news of Easter. Not just that Jesus was raised from the dead, as miraculous as that is to put our faith in Jesus and who he is. And not just the possibility of hope for one day somewhere else far in the future. But because of Jesus' death and resurrection, we have now been given everything we need to live the kind of lives that we were made to live, all by God's Spirit and divine power, which he has made available to us today. So friends, let me ask you, where are you most longing for the good life these days? The God life that God has made us for. And what part of your life feels most desperate for restoration and renewal or even resurrection to be experienced? Perhaps in some of your relationships, whether in your marriage or in your parenting or with your friendships, or maybe are in your character or in a desire to know the grace and forgiveness that Jesus makes available. Or maybe in needing to receive the comfort and strength and perseverance through difficulty or a time of grief. Or maybe in your just sense of meaning and purpose that at times feels empty or powerless. And friends, how could we open ourselves up today to actually receiving everything we need from God that God has made available because of the death and resurrection of Jesus at Easter? Well, Peter finishes his Easter encouragements and kind of implications in this passage, really inviting us into this exact experience and process. When he says this, he says, in view of all of this, all that God has done in Jesus, he says, make every effort to respond to God's promises, that we have a part to play in responding and receiving. He says, add to your faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness mutual affection, and to mutual affection most of all love. That Peter says here that when we truly open ourselves up to the today good news of Easter, then the idea of a life of faith in Jesus becomes about so much more than just hopes or beliefs for one day, but actually becomes about receiving from God everything we need to live a new kind of life, to follow Jesus in his way of life and love, adding to our faith goodness, and then experiencing, knowledge and wisdom as we grow, and perseverance through difficulty, and mutual affection for one another, and most of all, living out a life of love that God has made us for right here and right now. Friends, that when we recognize what God has done through Jesus at Easter and respond in faith, that we can begin to see our lives forever growing and changed, starting today, having been given everything we need to become the kind of people and communities of goodness, peace, and love. Friends, this is, again, the champagne-worthy good news of Easter. That through what God has done in Jesus, his death and resurrection, and by pouring out his Spirit, God has given us everything we need to live the kind of life that we were made for. And friends, well, that all makes popping the bubbly worthwhile on Easter, on this Easter Sunday. And while that can all be true today, the reality is that this good news also isn't just reserved for one day a year or one holiday a year. But that ever since that day that God raised Jesus from death, every single day since then is now infused with the power and possibility to receive everything we need from the God who made us to live the life of love that we long for. And around here, that is what we are about as a community, seeking to live into and grow in that life together on a journey together. We certainly don't do it perfectly, and we kind of fumble along the way. It doesn't always happen like a light switch. It's kind of a journey. But it is also beautiful and remarkable when we see it happen in one another's lives. And a couple of weeks from now, we're going to hear the stories of a number of people getting baptized and seeing what God is doing in a new way in their lives. And right now we have dozens of people already signed up for our Practicing the Way course to go on this journey of learning how to practice the way of Jesus and open our lives to God's Spirit day after day. And friends, if you long to be a part of that, Jesus has the invitation for all of us today to put our trust in him, in his life and his death and his resurrection, and the possibility of opening our lives to his risen Spirit to come and bring everything we need into our lives together today. So friends, may we know the champagne-worthy, big deal, good news, and celebration of Easter. That Jesus has, in fact, defeated death to give us a sure and certain hope for one day. And through his resurrection, Jesus has now made his Spirit available to bring a new kind of life and a new kind of world being started in his kingdom, that has become possible in our lives together today. It's something that we can receive to grow into becoming people of hope and goodness and love in a way that has the potential to change everything. Cheers and happy Easter.